The night Karen made that final call, everything changed, and none of us knew it would end with the police turning against her. She had threatened before, shouted before, dialed before, but this time her voice carried desperation, anger, and something dangerously close to panic tonight. I stood by the window watching flashing lights approach, wondering how many times one person could twist truth until neighbors stopped believing her. For months, she complained about noise, parking, visitors, and imaginary problems, each call louder than the last, each lie more dramatic than before. We stayed quiet, patient, hoping the storm would pass, trusting that someday she would grow tired of chasing battles that never truly existed. But that night, something felt different, heavier, like the air itself warned us this final complaint would not end like all the others. When the sirens stopped outside, my neighbor stepped onto the porch beside me, calm, steady, ready to finally speak the truth aloud today. The patrol car doors opened slowly, officers stepping out with tired expressions, already familiar with the address, already expecting another unnecessary confrontation again. Karen rushed from her house, pointing, shouting, demanding they listen, telling stories that shifted with every sentence, twisting small moments into dramatic accusations. This time, however, the officers did not rush to her side, their attention slowly moving toward us, their faces serious, patient, and observant. My neighbor greeted them respectfully, explaining the history, the repeated calls, the nights disturbed, and the growing frustration spreading through the entire street. One officer nodded slowly, as if remembering, as if connecting all the reports, the familiar address, the endless complaints stacking higher each week. Karen kept shouting behind them, demanding action, insisting we were dangerous, reckless, suspicious, her voice cracking as her control slipped away completely now. The officers exchanged a look, the kind that says everything without words, the kind that marks the moment patience finally reaches its limit. For the first time, she noticed their silence, their hesitation, and the way they no longer nodded along with her endless, practiced complaints. Instead, they began asking questions, careful, direct questions, about dates, about calls, about how many times they had been sent here before already. My neighbor answered calmly, each word steady, each memory clear, telling stories that lined up perfectly, stories the officers recognized from earlier visits. Karen's voice grew smaller, her anger turning into confusion, her confidence fading as she realized the attention was no longer fully on her. And in that quiet moment, standing under the flashing lights, everything shifted, and the story she had controlled for months began finally breaking. What happened next would change everything forever, but you need to see the next chapter to understand how her final call truly backfired. The silence that followed felt heavier than all her shouting combined, as if the entire street was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to land. One of the officers stepped forward and gently asked Karen to lower her voice, his tone calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. She looked stunned for a moment, like someone who had just realized the script she memorized no longer worked the way it used to. My neighbor stood beside me, hands in his pockets, relaxed but alert, ready to answer anything they asked, ready to finally clear everything up. The officer turned to him first, asking about the night, about the supposed noise, about the dangerous activity Karen had reported just minutes earlier. My neighbor explained that we had simply been talking outside, laughing quietly, enjoying the cool night air after a long, exhausting day at work. Another officer pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages slowly, his expression shifting as he recognized the address written over and over again. Karen noticed the movement and tried to interrupt, raising her voice again, insisting that this time was different, that this time something serious was happening. But the officer raised a hand gently, asking her to wait, telling her they needed to hear both sides clearly before making any decisions tonight. She hesitated, clearly not used to being asked to pause, her words stumbling as she stepped back slightly, her anger turning into nervous energy. The officer asked my neighbor how many times police had come out because of similar complaints, and he answered honestly, without exaggeration, without frustration. He spoke about sleepless nights, constant interruptions, and the growing tension that had quietly spread through the entire neighborhood over the past several months. The officers listened carefully, nodding occasionally, their faces serious as they began connecting patterns they had slowly been noticing for a long time already. One of them finally turned back to Karen and asked a simple question, how many times she believed she had called for help in the last few months. She blinked, caught off guard, her answer uncertain, her confidence slipping as she realized she didn't even remember the number anymore. The officer explained that they had records, many records, and that every call was logged, every complaint documented, every visit carefully written down in reports. Karen's expression changed instantly, her posture tightening as the reality of that information slowly settled into her thoughts, heavier with every passing second. My neighbor stayed silent, letting the moment speak for itself, letting the truth rise naturally without needing to push it forward at all. The flashing lights continued to wash over the street, reflecting off windows and cars, turning an ordinary night into something that suddenly felt incredibly important. Then one officer closed his notebook slowly and said something that made Karen's face lose all its color completely. The officer's voice remained calm, but the weight behind his words was impossible to ignore. He told Karen they had responded to more than a dozen calls from this address over the past few months alone. The number seemed to hang in the air like a loud echo, one that could not be denied or explained away easily. Karen tried to speak, but no words came out at first. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if she suddenly realized how serious the situation had become. The officer continued, explaining that each call required time, resources, and attention that could have been directed toward real emergencies happening elsewhere in the city. His tone wasn't angry, just factual, but that made it hit even harder. My neighbor shifted his weight slightly beside me, still calm, still quiet, allowing the officers to take control of the conversation without interruption. Another officer stepped forward and asked Karen to explain exactly what she believed was happening tonight that required police intervention. This time, her answer was different. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It sounded uncertain, scattered, like she was trying to rebuild a story that no longer made sense even to her. She mentioned noise, then paused. She mentioned suspicious behavior, then couldn't explain what she meant. She looked around as if searching for something to support her claims, but the quiet street offered nothing. No loud music, no crowd, no chaos, just a few neighbors standing outside, watching, listening, waiting. One officer glanced around slowly, taking in the peaceful scene, then looked back at Karen with patient eyes. He asked gently if anyone had threatened her, if she felt unsafe, if there was anything happening that required immediate protection. Karen hesitated again, and that hesitation said everything. My neighbor finally spoke, but his voice carried no anger. He explained how we had tried to avoid conflict for months, how we kept our distance, how we stayed respectful even when the calls kept coming. He mentioned missed sleep, interrupted evenings, and the constant tension that settled over the neighborhood whenever sirens pulled into the street. The officers listened carefully, and for the first time, it felt like the full story was finally being heard. Karen crossed her arms tightly, her shoulders stiff, her eyes darting from one officer to another, realizing she was no longer in control of the narrative. The officer who had spoken first nodded slowly, then said something that shifted the moment entirely. He explained that false or unnecessary emergency calls could become a serious issue if they continued repeatedly without cause. Karen's face tightened, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and fear as the meaning behind those words slowly became clear. Karen took a small step back, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted. The officer's words settled heavily in the air, and for the first time, she looked unsure of what to say next. The confident energy she always carried during these moments was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that made the scene feel completely different from every other night. One of the officers spoke gently but clearly, explaining that emergency services existed to protect people in real danger. Every call mattered. Every response took time and attention away from situations where someone might truly need immediate help. Karen nodded slowly, but it was clear she wasn't expecting this conversation to go in this direction. My neighbor remained calm, standing beside me without speaking. He didn't need to add anything. The truth was unfolding on its own now, and everyone could feel it. A few other neighbors had quietly stepped outside, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices earlier. They stood at a distance, watching silently, their presence adding to the weight of the moment. One officer noticed them and glanced around thoughtfully, taking in the quiet street and the peaceful atmosphere. There were no signs of danger. No loud noise. No disturbance. Just a calm neighborhood interrupted once again by another call. Karen finally spoke, her voice softer now. She tried to explain that she was only trying to keep the neighborhood safe, that she believed something wasn't right, that she was just being careful. The officer listened respectfully, nodding as she spoke. But when she finished, he gently asked if she had any clear reason to believe there was an emergency tonight. Karen paused again. That silence stretched longer than before. My neighbor quietly added that this wasn't the first time similar concerns had been raised without any real issue behind them. He spoke carefully, without accusation, simply sharing the pattern that had been building over time. Another officer checked something on a small device, likely reviewing past call records. His expression grew more serious as he looked up again. He explained that repeated calls without clear cause could lead to consequences if they continued. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning, delivered calmly, professionally, and without anger. Karen looked around, noticing the neighbors watching from their porches, noticing the officers no longer standing beside her but speaking to her as they would to anyone else. The balance had shifted completely now. She was no longer the center of concern, she was the reason for it. For the first time, she seemed to understand how serious things had become. The officer then asked a simple question that made everything feel even more real. The officer asked Karen if she understood what could happen if the calls continued without real emergencies behind them. His voice was steady, not unkind, but clear enough that no one could mistake the meaning. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her arms still crossed, her eyes fixed on the ground as she slowly nodded. It wasn't the quick, confident nod she usually gave. This one was slow, uncertain, almost reluctant, as if she was finally accepting something she had been avoiding for months. The street was completely quiet now. Even the neighbors who had stepped outside earlier remained silent, watching carefully, sensing that this moment carried more weight than any of the previous nights. My neighbor shifted slightly beside me, taking a deep breath. You could tell he wasn't enjoying this. None of us were. We never wanted things to go this far. We just wanted peace, quiet evenings, and a chance to live without constant interruptions. One of the officers stepped closer and spoke in a more understanding tone. He explained that they weren't there to punish anyone tonight. Their goal was simply to make sure everyone felt safe and to prevent situations from escalating unnecessarily. Karen finally looked up, her eyes moving from one officer to the other, searching their faces for something familiar. But there was no sympathy in the way she expected, only calm professionalism and patience. The officer continued, reminding her that emergency lines were for serious situations. When they were used repeatedly for problems that weren't truly urgent, it could cause delays for people who were actually in danger somewhere else. Those words seemed to land heavily. Karen's posture softened slightly. For the first time, she looked less defensive and more thoughtful, as if she was beginning to see the situation from a different angle. My neighbor spoke quietly then, not to accuse, not to complain, but simply to share how the repeated calls had affected everyone. He talked about the stress, the tension, and how the constant police visits made the neighborhood feel uneasy. He made it clear that no one wanted conflict. We just wanted things to settle down. One of the officers nodded and glanced around again, taking in the calm homes, the still night, the peaceful setting that had been interrupted too many times. Karen followed his gaze, noticing the same thing. The quiet, the stillness, the absence of anything that could justify another call. She let out a small breath, almost like a release, her shoulders lowering slightly. Then the officer said something that made the moment even more serious. The officer explained that from this point forward, any further calls from this address would be reviewed more carefully, especially if they followed the same pattern as before. His voice remained calm, but the message was firm and impossible to misunderstand. Karen's eyes widened slightly as she processed what that meant. It wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a clear line being drawn. My neighbor stayed quiet, his expression steady, but I could see a small sense of relief in his posture. For the first time in months, it felt like someone truly understood what had been happening. Another officer added that their goal wasn't to create trouble for anyone. They simply needed to ensure that emergency services were being used responsibly so they could help people who truly needed it. Karen swallowed hard and nodded again, this time more slowly. The energy around her had changed completely. The loud confidence that once filled the street during every call had disappeared. In its place was a quiet realization settling in. One of the neighbors across the street shifted on their porch, and Karen noticed. Her eyes moved from one house to another, seeing people watching quietly. Not judging, not speaking, just observing. It was the first time she seemed to notice how many people had been affected by the repeated late-night visits and constant tension. My neighbor finally spoke again, gently this time. He told the officers that he appreciated them taking the time to listen and understand both sides. He explained that no one wanted problems. Everyone just wanted to feel comfortable in their own homes again. The officer nodded and gave a small, understanding smile. He said that sometimes situations grow slowly over time without anyone realizing how serious they've become. But once they reach a certain point, they have to be addressed directly. Karen shifted her weight and looked down at the ground again. There was no anger left in her face now. Just a quiet discomfort and something that looked like regret. The officer asked if she felt safe returning inside for the night, if there was anything she actually needed help with right now. Karen shook her head gently. For the first time since the police had arrived, she had nothing to report. No complaint, no accusation, just silence. The flashing lights continued to reflect across the houses, but the tension that once filled the air had started to fade. Then the officer turned slightly toward my neighbor and said something that none of us were expecting. The officer turned toward my neighbor and thanked him for staying patient through everything that had been happening. His words were simple, but they carried a quiet respect that hadn't been shown before. My neighbor looked slightly surprised and nodded, telling them he never wanted things to become a bigger problem. He just wanted peace on the street and hoped the situation would calm down on its own. The officer understood. He explained that sometimes people believe they are doing the right thing, even when their actions start affecting others in ways they don't fully realize. Karen stood a few steps away, listening to every word. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. For the first time, she simply watched as the conversation continued without her controlling it. Another officer gently added that neighborhoods work best when people communicate directly and respectfully instead of letting frustration build until it turns into something bigger. The message wasn't harsh, but it was clear enough for everyone to understand. My neighbor nodded again, agreeing quietly. He admitted that the constant tension had made it hard for everyone to feel comfortable, especially when sirens showed up late at night again and again. One of the officers turned back to Karen and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He told her that if she ever truly felt unsafe, she should absolutely call for help without hesitation. But if there wasn't a real emergency, it would be better to find another way to handle concerns before reaching for the phone. Karen slowly nodded. Her eyes moved toward the ground, and she took a deep breath. It looked like she was thinking back on every call, every complaint, every moment that had led to this final conversation. The neighbors on their porches began to relax slightly, sensing that the situation was finally coming to an end. The tension that once filled the street had softened into something quieter, almost peaceful. My neighbor shifted beside me and let out a slow breath, the kind that comes after carrying stress for far too long. You could feel the relief settling over him. The officers began preparing to leave, their job nearly finished. One of them gave a final reminder to both sides, encouraging calm communication and respect moving forward. Karen looked up at that moment, and for a second, it seemed like she wanted to say something. But the words never came. She simply nodded again, her expression no longer angry, no longer defensive, just quiet and thoughtful. As the officers walked back toward their car, the red and blue lights still flashing softly across the houses, it felt like the street itself was finally breathing again. But just as the moment seemed completely over, something unexpected happened that made everyone pause. Just as the officers reached their car doors, Karen spoke up again, her voice quiet but clear enough to stop everyone in their tracks. It wasn't a complaint this time. It wasn't an accusation either. There was something different in the way she said their names, something that sounded almost uncertain. The officers turned back slowly, giving her their full attention once more. The entire street fell silent again, the neighbors watching carefully, unsure of what she was about to say next. Karen stood there for a moment, her hands no longer crossed, her posture no longer tense. She looked toward my neighbor first, then toward the officers. When she finally spoke, Her voice sounded smaller than it ever had before. She said she didn't realize how much the calls had affected everyone. She said she thought she was protecting the neighborhood, keeping things under control, making sure nothing bad could happen. But standing there now, seeing the way people were watching, hearing everything laid out so clearly, she admitted she might have taken things too far. My neighbor didn't respond right away. He just listened, his expression calm and steady. The officers remained silent as well, allowing her to speak without interruption. Karen took a slow breath and continued. She said the quiet nights sometimes made her nervous. Small sounds felt bigger than they were. Shadows looked like movement. And over time, she convinced herself she was doing the right thing by calling every time something felt even slightly wrong. There was no anger in her voice now. Just honesty. One of the officers nodded gently, understanding that fear can sometimes grow into something much larger when it's left alone for too long. He told her it was okay to want to feel safe. Everyone deserved that, but he reminded her that calling for emergency help should always be the last step, not the first reaction. Karen nodded again, and this time there was no hesitation at all. My neighbor finally spoke, his voice calm and sincere. He told her that no one was angry. Everyone just wanted things to feel normal again. He explained that if she ever felt worried, she could talk to them directly. They were neighbors, after all. That simple sentence seemed to change something in her expression. The tension in her face softened, and for the first time, she looked relieved. The officers exchanged a quick glance, clearly sensing the shift. The situation that had once been filled with frustration was now ending in a quiet understanding. As they turned once more to leave, it felt like the street was finally ready to move forward. But what happened the next morning proved that this night had truly changed everything. The next morning felt different the moment I stepped outside. The street was quiet in a peaceful way, not the tense silence we had grown used to over the past several months. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow across the houses, and for the first time in a long while, there were no flashing lights, no raised voices, no uneasy feeling hanging in the air. My neighbor was already outside, standing near his driveway with a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked relaxed, more at ease than I had seen him in months. We exchanged a simple nod, and it felt like a silent agreement that something had finally changed. A few minutes later, Karen stepped outside. For a brief moment, everything felt still again. But this time, there was no tension behind the moment. She walked slowly toward the edge of her yard, then stopped. It looked like she was deciding whether to say something or simply head back inside. Finally, she gave a small wave. It was subtle, almost hesitant, but it was the first friendly gesture we had seen from her in a very long time. My neighbor raised his hand and waved back without hesitation. I did the same. No words were needed. That simple exchange felt like the closing of a long chapter that had been weighing on everyone. The street began to wake up like any normal day. A car started in the distance. Someone down the block stepped outside to grab a newspaper. The peaceful routine of the neighborhood returned, and it felt genuine this time, not forced. As the days passed, the difference became even more clear. There were no more late-night sirens pulling into the street. No more loud arguments outside. No more repeated complaints breaking the quiet. Karen kept to herself, but she also seemed calmer. When she passed by, she would nod politely. Sometimes she even stopped to talk briefly. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was just a slow return to normal. My neighbor mentioned one evening that it finally felt like we could relax again. That constant pressure we had been carrying for months had slowly faded away. And the truth was, it wasn't just about one final call or one conversation. It was about being heard, being understood, and finally finding a way to move forward without conflict. The officers never had to return again for another complaint. And Karen never made another call. That night had been the turning point. The last time she reached for the phone was the moment everything finally changed. And sometimes, all it takes is one honest moment for a long story to finally come to an end.
Welcome to Karen Universe, where we dive into every wild, quirky, and intriguing story out there. During a brutal blizzard, Karen started screaming at my neighbor right in the middle of the street. Someone called the police, but when they arrived, they just stood
They are watching everyone unfold. What happened next turned a simple argument into a night no one in the neighbor will forget.
If you enjoyed the, don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends and drop your thoughts in the comments.